So I'm here to tell you a little bit about how we started the Food Network back in the mid-90s, which sort of changed the way that Americans looked at food via television. It all began in a town called Providence, Rhode Island, which up until 1990, Paulie Del Vecchio from Jersey Shore had not yet been born. And the only big news that was happening in Providence, Rhode Island was mafia rub-outs, because Providence was the sort of East Coast center for the mafia. The news director of the local television station in Providence really began to get worried about the lack of stories that there were to cover on the television station. And he solicited ideas from everybody in the Providence Journal newspaper and in the Providence Journal Broadcasting Corporation. And they had an employee's suggestion box. Somebody wrote down a message that said, why don't we work with the Johnson & Wales University? And for those of you who are in the food business, you know that that university in Providence provides us with goodness knows how many chefs across the country. And that little note, which was exactly what I just said, why don't we work with Johnson & Wales, is the thing that sort of triggered everything there was that became the Food Network. There is no recipe book for starting cable television networks. There are insane stories of people who lose a large fortune and wind up with a small fortune by starting cable networks, but nobody has a recipe book for actually starting one. The little piece of paper that was in the suggestion box worked its way up through the corporate channels and reached the man at the very top of the Providence Journal Broadcasting Corporation, a wonderful man called Jack Clifford, who now lives down in Rancho Santa Fe in California. And Jack said, well, that's an interesting thought, but how do we take what goes on at the school, at the university, and turn that into commercially viable television? He called an old friend of his called Reese Schoenfeld, who had started the cable news network for Ted Turner back in the 70s, and said, is it possible that we could take the courses that they teach at Johnson & Wales and turn that into a television network? And Reese said, absolutely no, it's impossible. But as they talked longer and longer, they both came to the agreement that what was lacking on television was a food network. I had worked with Reese at CNN as CNN's first show business reporter back in the late 70s, 79, and then early 80s, 80 and 81. Reese called me and said, we have this idea for a food network. And I joked immediately and said, that's the worst idea I've heard since sliced bread. Trying to be funny. And he said, hear me out. And so he talked about the most boring things that you could imagine that were taken right from the curriculum of the Johnson & Wales teaching courses. I said, none of this translates to television. What we need are, and the word had never been coined before, celebrity chefs. For those of you who watched Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous during its 15-year run, we featured a lot of chefs because they had become the same kind of star as a movie hero in Hollywood. You think of them by name: Wolfgang Puck, Jeremiah Tower. There were dozens of them that were slowly getting recognition on television. And I said, if you base this proposed Food Network around celebrity chefs, I think you may have something. But what they've got to do is they've got to be able to teach the viewer at home the very same meals that they make in their restaurants, but they've got to do it within 30 minutes. They have to do it neatly, cleanly, and easy to understand. Was it possible? Well, Emeril was one of the very first chefs that we signed on for the Food Network. And once we had Emeril on board, it was easy to get a lot of other chefs. Now it took 19 months from the time that the employee dropped the little note in the suggestion box to the day that we went on the air. You can imagine how much money we burned through in 19 months. This is not a easy to win business. I myself had to go out on the road for many of those months convincing cable operators across the country that we could produce 24 hours a day of cooking television. And we didn't have a way to do 24 hours of cooking television, so we broke the day into 3 8-hour parts. And so the first 8 hours ran, we taped everything, and then ran the same programming for the next 8 hours, and the same thing again for the final 8 hours of the day. This way we convinced, by lying, cable operators across the country that we could produce 24 hours a day of television programming. I want to tell you a little bit about who owns cable stations across America. I'm reminded every time that I hear the word Phoenix of the toughest sale that we ever made. We went to the owner of the cable television system in Phoenix, and he was a second-hand car dealer who had invested money in buying the underground cable to provide the homes of Phoenix and Scottsdale with cable television. You have to remember, cable television was very new because everybody still had rabbit ears on the top of their TV sets. Cable was an unknown factor, except that it had CNN and HBO and very little else. And we'd come along with an idea to sell food on television. All the guy in Phoenix wanted to know was, would the Food Network sell for him his second-hand cars? And I could never really understand what he was trying to ask me. And in the end, I just said to him, well, if you run ads, your ads at the top and bottom of every program on the Food Network, you'll sell cars because people will associate eating well with riding well. I didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And he put his cowboy boots up on his desk and he said, well, we'll give it a try. We had our first cable sale. A lot of other cable stations fell into place once we had one. But it took us going to 167 cities, one by one over those 19 months, to convince cable operations that the Food Network would become a reality. At the same time we were trying to sell cable facilities, we were trying to build the network in terms of chefs and programs and everything else. Finally, we got approval in New York to run the Food Network for 3 hours a day on Manhattan cable. And we had to be in Manhattan before we could start selling advertising, which of course pays for everything on television. It did not hurt that we had Mayor Rudy Giuliani's wife Donna Hanover, before they got divorced, as our main news anchor with the daily 6 p.m. news program. I think he really wanted her on the air and visible and not at home bothering him with municipal business, I think. After she lost her job at the Food Network, they got divorced. So I think I'm right with my theory. Once we had Manhattan, we were able to show Madison Avenue that we had programming and that ads bought on the network were really valuable. So we started with 100,000 cable subscribers. Today, the Food Network is 80 million cable subscribers. It took 20 years to get to that point. And unfortunately, as happens with businesses get sold from one company to another company, and the Food Network, which started out as an instructional network, was eventually bought and is still owned to this day by a company called Scripps Howard in Nashville, Tennessee, that also has the Do-It-Yourself Network, Home and Garden Television, and it veered off from the instruction of food preparation with celebrity chefs into the ugly world of reality television with game shows and reality contests, to where the only, in my humble opinion, the only great show that's now left on the Food Network of that nature is Chopped, which I think is a really, really phenomenal show. But I remember the first time that I sat down with the Iron Chef and we talked about how we could convert the Japanese program Iron Chef into an American version. And you know, it was really funny because none of the American chefs wanted to go do battle with Morimoto. They were frightened, they were scared. And the first chef who agreed to do it was Bobby Flay, promptly followed by the late Kerry Simon. And as you know, Iron Chef became a roaring success, mainly because nobody understood the host of the show except that he yelled and banged a drum. Television is about entertainment, it's not about education. So we began the Food Network on a very miserable November night in Manhattan. We had to rent a TV facility that had a satellite dish on top of it so that we could feed out the programs. And this is the honest truth. If we weren't stuck in the studio by virtue of the snow that was piling up outside, we were stuck in there because the hookers on 39th Street and 9th Avenue were crowded in our doorway getting the heat from the kitchen that was prepping the food for air. True story, I will never forget it as long as I live. The very first night, I don't know how many of you know New York, but 9th Avenue and 39th Street is like you cannot get worse, even to this day. And because we were in there with ranges, stoves, and food, we became the new headquarters for the rat population of New York City. I did a nightly show every evening at 9 p.m. called Talking Food, which was basically a complete rip-off of the Larry King Show. But instead of political guests or showbiz stars, we had chefs. And we talked with a talk show format. And one of our first guests was a country western star called Mickey Gilley, who owned a restaurant down in Nashville. And we had a 2-plate grill on the side of the anchor desk. And that was where the guest stars would cook their meals. So 2 things happened the night that Mickey Gilley came in. First of all, he set fire not only to the range and the frying pan, but also the studio. But great live television. Great live television. The second thing was that the fire, unfortunately, disturbed a lot of the other citizens of the underbelly. And so we had rats running across the studio floor. And I told the cameramen to chase them with the camera. And at moments like that, you realize that you're either totally insane, totally crazy, or something incredibly wonderful is about to happen. In the case of the Food Network, it became something incredibly wonderful. And my only regret is that I have no regrets about leaving the Food Network after my 5-year contract was up, because I'd launched it and it had become very successful. My only regret was that they shifted all of what we'd done into a thing called the Cooking Channel, and they determined that the Food Network should be reality game shows to do with food. And to me, it's sad, but you know, they bought the company. We all cashed in our chips, and now we have the Food Network and we have the Cooking Channel. I've told you how we got the Food Network up and launched. I told you how we found the chefs. It's always once you get the first, you'll get everybody else. I guess there's a lesson in that to do with the industry that you're all in. If there's one American caviar producer, there will hopefully be other American caviar producers. And when Brett called me and told me that he was doing this first food expo, I thought this will be the start of many others to come. You know, when the idea was first proposed, everybody said it's never going to work. I tell you one interesting fact about television. The most watched piece of television programming any time of the year has always been the Yuletide log at Christmas. More people turn on the Yuletide log at Christmas than any other. This speaks to the quality of television. It gets more viewers than the Super Bowl gets. And the reason I mention it is because it's hypnotic, it's addictive, and I like to think that's what we set out to do with the Food Network, that we could make the slicing of bread hypnotic, addictive television. And we did. And many of the people that we signed on as celebrity chefs who became TV stars in their own right, we had started that process during Lifestyles when we filmed chefs. We never filmed them actually cooking when we had them on Lifestyles. We featured them, their success, and their lifestyle. I think the way that we started the Food Network was perfect for what the Food Network should be today. People at home still want to know how to cook certain dishes. And I think that if you have 18 episodes of Chopped running in one day, after the 6th episode, you've seen as many episodes of Chopped that you want to see. I don't think you ever tire of learning how to cook something new. And if you have a great chef who is known as a public figure, and he is your teacher on air, I think you have the secret of the success of what should be the Food Network. I would take what's on the Cooking Channel and put it on the Food Network. I'd take almost everything off the Food Network and put it on the Cooking Channel. That's how I deal with it. We never hear about food in the normal news programming. Food is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Brett is leading the cause here for sustainable. He wants to end lionfish. Now, why isn't that story is worthy of a 60-minute expose? So there is certainly enough news in the food industry every day of the week that should be covered in some place. And even if it was only of interest to chefs, I still believe it's of interest to anybody that is interested in food. I love cooking. I don't get enough time to cook. I have to say that whenever I really have the time to make a meal, I will go to the Roma Kopf, and it's easy and lazy cooking because the pot does all the work. You don't have to do anything. But chicken with pasta, I'm a huge fan of Italian food, so my ideal meal before I die would be freshly picked tomatoes, the smaller the better, cooked very quickly in a hot frying pan with sugar, not salt, put on the top of freshly made mozzarella as an appetizer with basil from the garden, followed by chicken and pasta with pesto sauce. To me, perfect meal. Simple, tasty, thoroughly enjoyable. So that's what I would cook. All right, it's 20 past 10. The exhibits are open. Go to your exhibits. Thank you very much for coming and supporting Brett for the very first year of the Vegas Food Expo.